So a topic to discuss here is very simply going to be bracketed around how much an athlete weighs. This is not very applicable to general population, but it certainly there's things that are intervention based that can be very, very parallel. Because at the end of the day, I think there is an argument and a suggestion that an athlete should weigh as much as they possibly can, as long as they are still who they are. And that's throughout my career, I can think of times where the suggestion, oh well, so and so, or even the players saying it about themselves. Well, I play the best when I'm at 245. Or certain sports having their contracts that they have to weigh if the team holds them to it, where they weigh in between this and this. And now clearly the most important thing to discuss before I get into some of these things that maybe a lot of folks don't think about is you still have to be who you are. If carrying a certain amount of weight does not allow you to perform to the expectations of yourself or what the team has, well then all bets are off. We should not be weighing more if you can't be who you are. That can be from a work capacity standpoint. I don't know if it's as common in athletics as it is in the real world. But yeah, it's not ridiculous to say that your fitness, your endurance, your work capacity will probably be negatively impacted if you weigh more than what is ideal. Now, that can be in two different ways. If you're just over fat, a lot of times you can be over fat, and simply the reason is because you do not have ideal fitness. You don't engage in ideal fitness, so you carry more body fat. It's a pretty linear approach, and that's the part that you'll see in the general population piece. However, you may also find that if having increased weight in lean mass, so this is all very, very positive, particularly if you're in a rotary sport. At no point is it acceptable if your muscle mass or even fat mass is so robust that you can no longer get into the ideal positions to perform your sport-specific skills. Now, we can go back to some of these suggestions that we saw back in baseball, in the early 2000s, or always during golf, where he's going to be too big. I'm pretty sure the athletes that were supposedly taking PEDs were still able to get around on inside fastballs. And golfers that seem to, whatever they call lifting weights, are still using swings that nobody's complaining about at that time. So certainly if your arms become so big that you can't go through a rotary motion, well then we have done the wrong thing. That probably doesn't always happen nearly as much. Similarly, when it comes to fitness, when we look at certain sports, and I typically talk about the sports where I have firsthand knowledge in: golf, tennis, American football, basketball, powerlifting. I can't really think of anything else at the moment. When you look at individuals with significant body weight, significant lean mass, sometimes significant fat, you can still have the elite level of work capacity for that sport. If we talk about offensive linemen, regardless of how they look, there's going to be guys that carry more body fat, but they're able to play the whole game, and they're able to be healthy where there's no correlation to or an assumption that their limitations of work capacity are leading to injuries, particularly in the second half of the season. That you certainly do see that in other positions where running backs, far more injuries in after week 8. So again, you can be really, really fat and heavy and still have elite levels of fitness for certain sports. You don't see that in tennis, simply because in order to play 5-6 sets, The way you practice the sport is very, very similar to how you play the sport, and it's simply you're burning calories, and you're doing so over such a long period of time that you're simply never going to carry a lot of fat, and you don't see a heavily muscled individual because they're using muscle as well to generate energy through gluconeogenesis. Big word, bottom line is when you have these super long bouts of physical activity, you need to use whatever energy you have and whatever resources that you have. Now, when you don't have that long, very, very minimal rest periods like we see in tennis compared to what maybe an offensive lineman would do, you can then carry all that weight and still have elite fitness based on that sport. Years ago, very early in my time with Canada Basketball, we had a different team doctor than what we did when I finished. And he was not a pleasant fellow. I kind of got, enjoyed getting into pissing contests where I don't even remember who he thought was the highest level of fitness in all sports. And I knew what he was saying because, he said it was, the long distance bikers or midfielders in global football. But I'm like, you can't say who has the highest level of fitness, because if you take that long distance Tour de France cyclist and put him in offensive line, then he's not fit anymore. So fitness can only be described based on the needs of what to be fit for what. I think we often confuse fitness with health. Those are two very, very different things. We could argue that you could have an extremely high level of fitness for your sport, which may include things other than just cardiac health, but you may not have any of the other factors that would be linked to all-cause mortality. You often have to trade. The more specific you are in your activity, probably the further away you would get from health. But it can be. You can have and it can be even another example. Years ago, we saw early in his MMA career Brock Lesnar, who no one is going to confuse with carrying significant amount of excess body fat, especially when he has to get down to 275. And he was fighting a guy who was even bigger in Shane Carwin. And I think in the second round, maybe it was the first round, I don't remember, Shane Carwin was choking him out, and basically Shane Carwin gassed out, and Brock Lesnar came back to win in the next round. You have two individuals with extremely low body fat, but anytime you carry a lot of weight for good reason, from a health standpoint, doesn't matter, it still costs more to move that body for a long period of time, not necessarily a short one when you then get rest. MMA, not a whole lot of rest during the round or during the breaks. So you can have tremendous ideal body fat percentage. You could have high body fat. You can both, and one is going to gas out versus the other being extremely fit, just based on the needs of the sport. So if any of those factors get out of line, then there's no use in continuing this discussion. They weigh too much. You can have good weight, you can have not so good weight, you can have not so good weight for health, but good weight for your sport. All of these things play a role. And certainly if your mass of any kind gets in the way of how you move, well, soft tissue approximation, that certainly matters in a lot of different spaces. However, I'm still going to take the approach that if we can handle all of those things, we have the sport-specific work capacity, we have an appreciation for the current status of health, and we're not at all challenged in the ability to get into the elite joint positions of the sports skills, we still would like to weigh as much as possible, and here's why. Okay, it's very, very simple, going to be illustrated in this equation. Force equals mass times acceleration. Okay, the game is always to increase force. We would certainly like to increase force as fast as possible. We want the most force, and we want to generate it as fast as possible in our sport skills. Now, Here's the thing. Force can be generated with two variables. So the force will go up when you weigh more. This is a guarantee. If you take a golfer who's hitting the ball 250 yards and you put on 20 pounds of bad weight, fat, he's a pig now, and all of a sudden that 250 yards is going to become more. I don't know how much, but it will be more. So as long as that 250 pounds has nothing to do with changing the sequence or the technique of which that individual swung the golf club. So having more mass with the exact same performance increases force. Okay? That will happen as a law of physics. Something that has nothing to do with sports. For instance, if you are to do a high velocity, low amplitude thrust at chiropractor, physical therapist, etc., where you've got the individual on the side and the table's low enough where you can drop on them. If the therapist weighs 300 pounds, they're going to be able to create more force on their drop. It doesn't mean that the smaller therapist can't create the same amount of force, but they are going to have much more keen, efficient technique, and they're going to have to do it faster. The big, heavy therapist can just drop because they have more mass. Less mass, we need to move faster. We need to accelerate. It's not necessarily faster. We need to accelerate at a higher level. Okay, so if increases in mass do not affect position, they do not affect fitness, and they do not affect the specific work capacity, I kind of want you to be bigger. I want you to be Shaq. I want to be able to lean and be, as long as I can still be who I am in terms of generating the sports skills, I am now a load that by definition, that once it is in motion, it tends to stay in motion. Meaning my opponent now has to work that much harder in order to get me to stop my position or change my position. So that can be with bad weight or good weight. Now we would always probably prefer to have good weight. We want to decrease. If we're going to gain weight, we're always going to have some degree of fat. You cannot gain muscle perfectly. I'm only going to gain muscle, not significant. So if you're going to gain 10 pounds, let's just say it's going to, if you're doing things really, really well, it's going to be maybe 6-7 pounds of lean mass and 3 pounds of fat. It's all going to happen, and it's all going to increase force. Now, here's something else to keep in mind, and I know we talked about this in the past, but not on this platform. When we look at young athletes, and now I'm typically talking about tennis and golf, where these rotary sports have significant load differently than the team sports. The variation of movement is not nearly as much as what you would see in American football. Even if you play the field in baseball, hitting is very, very similar. So I guess if you're a DH at the age of 12 or you're only pitching. But let's think of, there's been some very, 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 very good players in Major League Baseball that don't look like they're in real good shape. Pitchers. John Kruk. If we look at golf, you can see guys that are really, really heavy that seem to still do well. Well, and they have durability, like they don't get hurt nearly as much as the skinny or what appear to be more fit guys. And there's something that when you see these junior athletes that are never carrying a lot of weight, combination, they haven't hit puberty yet, combination, they're not eating like an athlete, combination that they're not training to improve mass nor eating to complement that training. So what will happen is they have to deliver a significant amount of acceleration because they don't have a significant amount of mass. Now that is very, very important for the young athlete. This is why we see young athletes in these rotary sports with elbows and labrums in tennis and back pain or labrums or hip issues that start at a very, very young age in golf. because they don't have a lot of mass, so they have to rely on incredible athleticism, incredible mobility. Now, we're going to see that as well. I'm mentioning these sports where mobility is always of value, because if you have more mobility and you have more time to create this cascade, force can go up. All right, so if you have more period of time in which you can generate your power, well, then you're going to probably hit the ball further. You're going to throw the ball faster. But here's the catch. When you require such incredible high levels of acceleration, you have to have significant amount of deceleration. And injuries can happen in accelerative phases. They can also happen in deceleration phases. I think we'd probably find that there's a significant body of work that would support injury limitation, no such thing as prevention, in how we decelerate. Well, what if we didn't, how do we get away with this? Because of course we're going to try to train to be better at deceleration. This is part of the training and the development process. But if at some point, more force doesn't always make me better. Speed of force makes me better. Durability and consistency might make me better in some sports. What if I kept A the same, or maybe if I got M to be so big and I didn't need as much A, I wouldn't have to decelerate as much, but I would keep force the same. And that's the protection that we see. This is why you see in tennis that I mentioned before, you're never going to see a tennis player that's heavily muscled or jacked. They're going to look a particular way. And even the ones that look more athletic are still very, very slim compared to what we see in other sports. We understand why. It's just the way the sport is played. And the only way to last that long is you have to eat up your energy stores. Whether you probably can't keep up. You'll never get big. Because again, there's a time frame and it's also cultural in how tennis is practiced. You practice tennis very similar to how you play tennis. But now if I take that tennis player who has significant mobility at the ages of 12 and 13, where they're not, if it's a boy, maybe they haven't gone through puberty yet, they have incredible amounts of external rotation because they're slim and tennis found them and they're able to be successful. And then when they're successful, they're going to play all the time, and it becomes this underground culture of continuing to specialize early. Well, maybe one way to minimize those labrum injuries that then are getting surgeries 2 and 3 by the time they're in their middle 20s is to just be bigger. Because if they were heavier and somehow were able to figure out how to still be great enough at the game of the sport of tennis, but still could train and eat and understand these laws of physics, they wouldn't have to decelerate as much. They probably wouldn't have to accelerate as much and put load on those internal impingement positions. I'm not talking about what you do about it after it's already in there. But unless you plan to get that labrum, live with it, or get it sewn up, this is the answer. When you get, it's not only about getting stronger. You can put on any kind of weight. You won't have to swing as hard to create the same F. And I think that is a big piece here when we look to bulletproof injuries. Again, impossible to completely bulletproof. But when we look at these young athletes in golf, you're going to hit the ball further with the exact same swing. Now, the big money is obviously if you can have as much of this and you keep this as high as possible, but then you have, because you are strong and you are stable and you are skilled, then you basically have a bobsledder. I mean, you have some of the most inclusive athletes of so many different qualities. You have a decathlete, a heptathlete. You have they're good at everything. You have an elite CrossFitter. When you have high levels of mass, but again, even in the sports that I just described, you're going to have a ceiling to where any one of those particular qualities, because you simply can't be as great at that sport. But if we can increase pounds and still be who you are, that's the argument, and it's really based on the laws of physics and how acceleration begets deceleration. Deceleration is likely where we're going to see a lot of injuries. We don't necessarily see it in the jump, you see it in the land. And then, of course, whatever the issue is with the patellar tendon, it then becomes a jumping issue, but it was never a jumping problem. You may not have to work as hard to be able to land efficiently, but you might still get just as high, even if you weigh more. So you still have to be who you are, but I think there's a high value to appreciating that it's okay. And in my experience, particularly in youth tennis, and then when you add the very, very real and the very, very fair social issues, particularly involving young females in having weight on their body. All of these things need to be taken into account. I'm speaking simply from the laws of physics. Force equals mass times acceleration. You can get a lot of F from M, you can get a lot of F from A. If you have a lot of M and you don't need as much A, you don't need as much deceleration, you'll get the same force and the same performance without the demands that we see from high levels of stabilization. So hopefully that all makes sense. I don't think it's a big issue, particularly if you don't lose fitness. And at the end of the day, there are ways to maintain high levels of mass and high levels of fitness. And that's what we're going to be a big part of if you take a look at the latest Training Eagles Rehab Elite Performer Program. We're going to look at a lot of these protocols that support that process. I hope that all makes sense, and I do hope if anybody sees a leprechaun up in that tree, say yeah. Audio